Welcome, everyone. My name is Sunny Kim, and I am the program manager for UCSB's ABA program. And today we have the wonderful Michelle, who is an autistic BCBA, here to talk about her journey. And I think it's full circle. So, Michelle, I am so excited to have you today as our guest speaker, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sunny. Hi, everyone. I'm super excited to be talking a little bit about my experience as an autistic BCBA and also navigating ABA with lived experience. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you guys a little bit of insight as to kind of like how I became who I am, my therapy experiences, but then also too, I'm also going to kind of give an idea about my diagnosis journey because I do think that that is very much worthy to hear about, um, especially because, coming into being autistic, I was actually diagnosed very young, and that is pretty rare for girls to be diagnosed with autism at a young age. It's a lot rarer for girls than it is for boys. So that being said, I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And then I also really wanted to talk about how we can make ABA really as compassionate and client-centered as possible, at least from the lens of an autistic BCBA. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and get started. So, this is a little bit about me. So, this is how I actually got into ABA. So, I volunteered at an ABA clinic for a social skills group in 2010. Funny enough, the person that I was doing the social skills group with was my old speech therapist, which you'll hear me talk a little bit about how I had speech therapy for a few years. And I fell madly in love with what I did. So, I wanted to pursue it. And so, funny enough, I was actually in journalism. That was my bachelor's degree, but then I wanted to finish out my bachelor's degree and then go right into my master's degree for applied behavior analysis. How I started working was I actually worked in a behavioral health facility in 2013, February 2013, over in Indianapolis, Indiana. I transferred to that same facility's ABA clinic about 6 months later. That being said, I worked in the clinic from 2013 to 2015, and I started doing more like home and in school services from 2015 on. I became a BCBA in 2016. It did take me a few tries to get there, but that being said, that's just indicative of how great I am at testing, which is not. And that being said, I did direct therapy from 2016 to 2018, and then I became a supervisor from 2018 on. I started out by doing direct therapy as a BCBA because that was more my comfort zone. So that's why I did it for that long. And then I became a clinical supervisor, actually going into a new role within a new job and a new location. And I've been in clinical director roles on and off for about 3 years. I am currently the director of clinical development for a company over in Fairfax, Virginia, where I am working with BCBA candidates. I'm working with students, I'm working with RBTs that really want to grow within the field of applied behavior analysis. So I'm in that position. I've been in that position for about 7 months now. But in total, as far as clinical director goes, I've been in roles on and off for about 3 years. So, how did I even get into ABA services? So, first, I had to get my diagnosis. So, I do want to preface this with this is based on an interview that I had with my mom because I was diagnosed very young. I was diagnosed in 1995. And so I'll age myself. I was 3 years old at that point. So my behavior differed from my older brothers, and I wasn't meeting developmental milestones on time. I wasn't talking, my walking was delayed. I had toileting concerns too. I wasn't toilet trained until I was about 4 years old. So there was a lot of concerns with me meeting developmental milestones. My mom consulted a family friend who happened to be a doctor, and they suggested that I might be autistic and recommended testing. And this is just based on the one lecture he had. He learned about autism very briefly. And this was at the time in the early 1990s. So, again, there wasn't a whole lot about autism out there. So, he actually made this recommendation. At the time that my mom was seeking out concerns and seeking out answers, really, our pediatrician actually dismissed concerns. And the thing is, they said, I was the third child, which I was. I am the third child. I'm the youngest in my family. And the third child tends to quote unquote develop slower. And they also said that I just needed a nap, which clearly was not true. Of course, too, a family friend had actually shared an article by Temple Grandin, which resonated with my mom, who basically said that this is my daughter. And my mom could not give me the name of the actual article, but she did say that it was in the New Yorker and it was in the 1990s. So we were living in Brandon, Florida at the time that everything was happening. And so with that, we actually ended up moving to Sarasota County. And after moving, they actually recommended, and by they, I mean a colleague of my mom's, recommended a doctor named Dr. Fuchs in Sarasota County. Now, I came into the doctor's office and I was, I guess, just really not really like behaving appropriately, I guess, per the doctor. I screamed, flipped out, all of that. And so, because of that, he said that though he had limited knowledge of autism, he offered resources. He said he only took one class as well. So he did offer resources and did pretty much anything he could to help me get tested. For testing, at that point, I was recommended to get tested for autism. And then basically what happened was I went through multiple providers via Child Find for my screening. So Child Find is actually still something very popular to this day. This is something that was used back in the 1990s when I was being diagnosed. My mom completed social and developmental forms for me in 1994, November of 1994, and testing began about a month later. The difference between screenings back then and now, it seems like screenings now are a lot quicker from what I understand. Back then, it actually took a little bit longer. What I noticed is they progressed from different types of providers. So there was a special education teacher that was involved. There was a psychiatrist, a medical doctor, a neurologist. So there was a lot of different people that were involved in my testing of being diagnosed with autism. And at the end of the day, I was diagnosed with pervasive developmental disorder, not other specified, in February 1995. Why I say I'm autistic is because this PDD-NOS, pervasive developmental disorder, not other specified, is actually under the autism umbrella. So that being said, that's why I say I'm autistic, because even though providers avoided labeling me as autistic, fearing that diagnosis would limit me, I felt that it would resonate better if I said I was autistic. So that being said, funny enough, the psychological report labeled me as being severely autistic based on the CARS or the childhood autism rating scales. For those of you who are getting into testing, that's one of the tests that they used actually to officially diagnose me with autism. So, and also too, you'll notice that I put this picture on the right, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, but this was actually me in one of my therapies. So on the left is my sensory integration therapist, which I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And then that was me going through therapy with that particular provider. So now let's talk about ABA. So, per Cooper, Heron, and Heward, ABA focuses on the science of behaviors. It differs from fields like psychology, counseling, or teaching in its focus of goals and methods. So, objectively defining goals and socially significant behaviors for increase or decrease. And, the whole point is to improve behaviors that may seem very socially significant to change. Also, too, it uses methods to prove the intervention caused the behavior change. So we have antecedent strategies, we have consequence strategies, we might have different teaching methods like DTT, discrete trial teaching, and naturalistic environment teaching. And it relies on scientific methods, including objective behavior descriptions, quantification, and controlled experimentation. That's your interventions. That's your, clearly defining your behaviors, um, your data collection, all of those things. So I do have to bring this up because as being an autistic BCBA goes, this is an argument that I hear very often. So I see it on social media. I see it almost everywhere. That being said, I am curious to know how many of you have heard the ABA is abuse argument. And that being said, yeah, I mean, that being said, it is something that I, as an autistic BCBA, understand. I do very much understand that 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 is an argument that is still very prevalent to this day. So I did actually want to talk a little bit about some of the research about concerns about an ABA-based intervention because I wanted to cite from the research, and then I also want to talk a little bit about my own experiences. So, of course, the top 4 concerns that were looked at was the use of shock, intensity of intervention, rigid formulaic instruction, and changing autistic behavior to neurotypical behavior. So the use of shock, one statement made about Lovaas was the use of shock therapy, and it stated that shocks were administered in order to stop repetitive and compulsive behaviors. So in the article, it actually stated that this was not true, and shock was actually used to address life-threatening, self-injurious behaviors up until the 1970s through his practice at UCLA. And this was the Pre-Young Autism Project, aka YAP. If you have not heard about this, I would highly recommend that you do some research on this because it's very interesting, to say the least. There was also the history of the spank. Spanks were delivered as a replacement for shock, and this was eliminated by the 1970s. But that being said, too, reinforcement-based procedures ultimately replaced any form of punishment-based procedures. And again, we try to use reinforcement first. We always want to rule out reinforcement before going into punishment. I do want to preface this with a however, because the Judge Rottenberg Center still uses an electric shock device called the Gradual Electronic Decelerator, otherwise known as the GED, as a way to decrease target behaviors for reduction, specifically self-injurious behaviors. And this has actually fueled the fire about the ABA is abuse argument. There has been the hashtag stop the shock movement. And so even though there are BCBAs who are advocating on the stop the shock movement, there's still a lot of arguments that because of this, ABA as an entire science is being classified as abuse. And so it's really important to note this because this is part of our history. We do have a rough history, but at the same time, as an autistic BCBA, I want to make sure that that changes. And I know personally, I don't agree with what they are doing, but that being said, that is one concern that has been brought up before as far as the ABA is abuse argument goes. The intensity of intervention was also something else that was brought up. So another statement made about Lovaas was that exactly 40 hours a week per therapy was prescribed to those who received his services, which was also not true. The average was 40 hours per week, but the number was dependent on how much support was needed. So just like how we work with our clients now, some clients receive 20 hours a week. Some clients might receive only 10 hours a week. I don't think there's a single client at my center personally that receives more than 30 hours a week of therapy. I think that's the most. And even then, that's still a lot. And also, the article mentioned too that there's no data to support that the prescription of therapy has harmful effects. However, I will say, personally speaking, 30 to 35 hours a week of therapy is a lot. It's a full-time job. And so that being said, if there is a rationale for higher prescription, it's supposed to closely resemble school because students are expected to go to school about 30 to 35 hours a week. Now, if they're going to school and having ABA services, that's going to potentially cause a lot of burnout if you're going to recommend a high amount of therapy and they still go to school. So it's really important to be very mindful when you're, making those recommendations. Also, too, another concern that was brought up was rigid formulaic intervention. Another statement that was made was that there was ABA is a one size fits all approach, no matter their developmental age. And actually, what the truth was that he believed in creativity, innovation, probing, and individualized intervention. This is how ABA should be. This is how ABA luckily was for me when I was having it and when I was receiving it. And that's something that really should be happening across the board. You know, we're here to change lives. We're here to make the lives of our clients change in many different ways. And this is one that hurts my heart probably the most is changing autistic behavior to neurotypical behavior, autistic behavior to neurotypical behavior. It was stated that behavior analysts want to have the same outcomes as Lobos and want a cure. ABA is unjustifiably holding up neurotypical behavior as an ideal, arguing its attempt to change how an autistic acts, reacts, or interacts with the world is wrong. And this is from Amy Sequenzia. She was a self-advocate. And, you know, again, this was not true. One thing to mention was outcomes have been stated that with early intensive behavior intervention, EIBI, is that the child's autism spectrum disorder is cured and no longer autistic, which is problematic. Autism is for life. I was diagnosed when I was 3 years old. I'm still autistic as a 33-year-old woman. So that being said, you know, autism doesn't go away. Autism does not go away as soon as you hit adulthood. It doesn't go away, period. One thing I do want to mention, though, is sometimes with ABA comes masking. Masking is known as when an autistic person changes their behavior to match societal norms, but remains essentially autistic. So, for example, you might teach a behavior, or you might be in a situation where a client might have to change the way that they act to meet what neurotypical students might do instead. And this can actually cause for what's called autistic burnout, because if they're expected to hide, quote unquote, their autistic behaviors, whether that be like self-stims or whether that be just like scripting or anything like that, if they're expected to suppress that, that can lead to burnout, that can lead to meltdowns. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as the presentation goes on too. But that being said, the outcomes of EIBI being standardized makes it very difficult to support that masking occurs. So through the article, it's been disproven, but do know that masking is something that can happen and does happen within ABA. So what does the research suggest? Number one, we need to do a self-evaluation. So we need to look at ourselves. We need to figure out, okay, what's the kind of practice that I do as a behavior analyst? We also need to continue to advocate for positive reinforcement interventions. This is very important because, again, we should always be ruling out positive reinforcement. You know, we should always be doing that instead of going straight to punishment. We need to determine the prescription based on individual need. Our science is individualized. We're changing individuals' lives. And at the end of the day, the prescription that we give or the recommendations that we give should not be based on what everyone else thinks or what, you know, what even what the family thinks, you know, because sometimes families will try to influence and say, oh, I know that my child needs this amount of therapy. As a behavior analyst, you have to do your own, you know, observation, assessment to really give a determination of how many hours a client should have for therapy services, if ABA is even recommended to. I also want to put that out there because sometimes ABA isn't the right choice for that particular client. And of course, to evolve and be progressive with our methods. As a BCBA, I am expected to gain continuing education. I am expected to continue researching, continue advocating. And so I definitely cannot recommend enough that we need to be progressive. And again, looking at it from a client-centered lens. So I'm an autistic BCBA. So that being said, what was my journey in ABA like? And I do want to mention that I am one sole autistic BCBA. I am one sole provider. So my views and my experiences may not match within the community. I am not the voice of the community. I am my own voice. So I just want to make sure that I put that out there. So my therapy journey, my mom jumped for joy at the sound of a diagnosis. So basically, she wanted to know what was next steps, which was basically getting evaluated for services. So I had ABA in the 1990s. And if we want to get real specific here, I got ABA in 1995, about the time that I had officially finished getting diagnosed was about the time that I had officially gotten evaluated and started within ABA. Funny enough, my mom had a parent coach, someone called a parent coach that came in once a quarter to teach her how to teach me skills that I needed for my everyday life. And the Behavior Analyst Certification Board did not officially come into fruition until 1999. So keep in mind, when I had ABA, it was not like what it is today. So that's why you'll see parent coach as opposed to BCBA. And that being said, it was more parent led as opposed to RBT or behavior tech led. And this approximately lasted about 6 months. However, my mom hired tutors, which we would call therapists, to help out. And again, these were not bound by the Behavior Analyst Certification Board because it didn't even come into fruition until 1999. And I was done with ABA basically at that point. Tutors worked with me on and off for about a couple of years, give or take maybe some of that time. I know that during that time, I was also pushed to do some extracurriculars. I was also in speech therapy for about 6 years. So the speech therapy that I was in for 6 years, I had the same speech therapist, and that's the same person who I volunteered with at that clinic. So it was really interesting to actually get that connection and go back into ABA because of her. I also had sensory integration therapy for about a year. So that's that picture that's been showing up a few times. And also, I had an individualized education plan for several years as well. Funny enough, too, I went to a Christian school and I still had an IEP through a public school because my Christian school did not offer speech. They did not offer any they didn't offer any like IEP type of services because it was a private school. There was nobody trained in special education at that school. So I had to go to a different school to get the services that I needed. And so I did that for a few years while I was at the Christian school. I bounced around a little bit. And then I also was formally excused from my IEP before junior high school. So at that point, I had already been done with ABA, but I needed to officially be done with all of the services needed because I basically I had mastered out like of the skills that I needed to have. So did the therapy help me? Yes, of course. But the progress that I made was based on the individualized support that I was given. My mom played a really, really big role. My mom is somebody that continues to be my cheerleader on a daily basis. And that's somebody that, really helped me throughout the course of my life. And so I think it's really worth noting that, again, the progress that I made was based on the individualized support. I will always be autistic no matter the progress I have made in ABA therapy or in any capacity. That's just it. When it comes to the research and when it comes to talking about cures and talking about things like that, of course, we know that ABA does not cure autism. It's not, and autism doesn't go away. But that being said, it's really important to note that just because of the progress that was made doesn't mean that it's I am any less autistic than I was back then. Now, granted, I've been able to learn a lot of skills. I've been able to do a lot of things in my life thanks to ABA therapy, but that doesn't mean that I'm not autistic anymore. So after reading the research, I do have some thoughts. And again, these are my views and may not necessarily align with the community. So I do believe that there is an excessive use of milestones. Unfortunately, I've still witnessed the implementation of such concerns, especially the excessive use of milestones written on an assessment, written based on an assessment being written for every single goal a child receiving services needs to meet and fading out of services once those goals have been achieved. Just to give an idea, I actually worked with a behavior analyst who had worked with this child on the VB map. He mastered every single milestone out of the VB map. And then she was basically saying, oh, hey, they should automatically graduate from ABA because they mastered out of the VB map. And no, that's not what you should do, because there's always something to work on. But besides that, just because you graduate from a skills assessment doesn't mean that you've graduated from ABA. There's a lot of other things that still need to be worked on when you think about it. Think about some of the goals that are socially significant for the clients that we work with, which is why I talk about my next point, seeking feedback from neurodivergent people. I feel that neurotypical behavior analysts definitely need to do a better job of seeking feedback from a range of neurodivergent individuals. And the reason for that is because the therapy that we provide is supposed to be individualized. And how we work with our clients can ultimately affect their lives, either for the better or for the worse. We do have to keep mental health in mind. It's not fun hearing that my science is considered abusive. It's not. But I also feel that it's very, very important to acknowledge that there is not the best history with ABA. Ask how we can do better. And not only that, but apply it. Don't just say I'm listening. Don't just say I'm here and I get it. No, it's really important to advocate on the betterment and for the betterment of your clients within your own practice, because that's how you become a compassionate behavior analyst. I also think that this cookie cutter ABA, that's something that was touched on in the article. There's not such thing as a one size fits all approach. I have seen it happen where, some behavior analysts will copy goals from different plans and try to do the same things. And we really need to match real life. The whole point is for us to use and work on behaviors that are socially significant for the client, especially when you talk to a client and you might say like, okay, what are some things that you really want to work on? I've been very lucky and have worked with a variety of clients who have advocated for themselves and have said, hey, this is what I want to work on. But even for those clients who are non-speaking, non-vocal verbal, I've been able to gauge some of that as well. So I know sometimes parents will definitely have their set of concerns, which I totally understand. And I definitely can agree and validate those concerns as well. But also, I have to think from the perspective of the client. What do they need? And so that's one of the cool things about being an autistic BCBA is I can kind of relate on more of a personal level. I know what it's like to have felt trapped, and I know what it's like to have felt like, no one is listening. And I want them to know that I am ultimately a safe space for them. Also, I think it's really important to be aware of the language that we use. So we need to be able to be aware of our language. You're going to hear me talk a little bit about um, verbal versus nonverbal versus vocal versus non-vocal. You'll hear me talk a little bit about how we can describe our clients better, especially because this is something that is really important, especially when it comes to describing our clients and being able to identify how we can best talk about our clients, because we need to treat them with respect and dignity. So why am I even here? Why am I a BCBA if I have seen the history of ABA not being the best and hearing about ABA being abusive? I'm here because I want to change the lives of my clients for the better. This is a life-changing field. We get to go home at the end of the day and do what we want to do after we get home from session, or in my case, I'm a remote hybrid BCBA. So after I log off or after I go back to the hotel room, because I will travel up to Virginia for my job, I get to do that. But my clients live with the effects. They're the ones who are going through the changes. And so I want to make sure that I change the lives of my clients for the better through that client-centered, trauma-informed neurodiversity affirming care. That is the way that we can get geared towards compassionate behavior analysis. Because as somebody who has been in ABA before, although I've been very lucky and I had the support of my mom and she knew exactly how to work with me, not everybody is my mom. Not everyone is a compassionate behavior analyst, or not everyone is a compassionate person. And so I think it's really important to note that, being here to provide that client-centered, trauma-informed, neurodiversity affirming care is what will help our clients be able to do some of the amazing things that they are more than capable of. So how can how can you do that? So there's a few things that I'm going to talk a little bit about within this realm. First, I'm going to talk about client dignity. I'm going to go into language, so person first versus identity first language. I'm going to also go into functioning labels and why they can be problematic. I'm also going to talk about behavior reduction and behavior replacement goals, how we can choose goals that are really socially significant for the client to decrease. Also, instructional goals that we can work on. And finally, supporting autistic advocacy organizations. So those are areas that I'm going to be talking about within that. So first and foremost, client dignity does equal respect. Okay, that isn't just, giving them privacy. It is not just saying, oh, well, we need to talk to our clients with kindness. No, it's actually respecting their boundaries. It's respecting that they might need a safe space. It's respecting them for who they are as individuals. So that's where we really want to make sure that we are providing them with the respect that is needed. That's how we can be compassionate providers, is by giving respect. I mean, think of the golden rule, you know, treat others the way you want to be treated. Let's also do that for our clients. Just because our clients are, different, or they might have different ways of learning, different ways of being, doesn't make it any less. Now, going into person first versus identity first language, this is also going to go into client dignity a little bit, because how we identify our clients is how we can provide respect and client dignity. So, person first is identifying the person for who they are with the diagnosis. I am a woman with autism. She has autism. She has a disability. So I'm identifying myself as a person, but then I am also identifying the diagnosis after. But then there's also identity first language. I am an autistic woman. She is autistic. She is disabled. Now, that being said, I have heard that we should go towards identity first language in various CEUs. I've also heard from some people in the disability community that they don't want to be identified. They don't want identity first language. So that being said, it is extremely difficult to give a straight answer, because what I might prefer, because I do prefer identity first language, it's hard to necessarily say that that is the case for the community. We can't generalize or overgeneralize what the community wants. So, that being said, it is up to the person. Now, if the person may not be able to say, I prefer identity first language, or I prefer person first language, then that might be something where you might talk to parents, talking to them about the difference between person first language and identity first language. What do you think that your child prefers? Do you want them to hear that they are autistic? Do you want them to hear that they are a person with autism? You know, I think that's really important to make sure that we gauge, because that's also how we can give respect to our clients. Because at the end of the day, this is how they want to be treated. Do we want them to hear the word person with autism, or do they want to hear that they're autistic? And the reason why, too, I also talk about this is because um, diagnoses can definitely bring a lot of stigma. And I know that for a very long time, I did not want to be called autistic because there was a lot of stigma that kind of kept in with my own personal life. My own biological father called me an autistic freak when I was 14 years old. And so, because of that, I actually ended up going towards person first language. But then working through that trauma and working through a lot of deep rooted issues related to that, I started to accept the word autistic. And so we want to teach that identities are valid, but at the same time, we also want to teach that how they want to identify themselves is also valid. Let's also talk about functioning labels and also why they're problematic. I think this is extremely important to note because we hear these terms a lot. I know I hear them very often. So there's high functioning, low functioning. High functioning assumes that the person is able to function in everyday society despite the supports that are needed. So in my case, yes, I am considered quote unquote high functioning. I don't like being talked about as being high functioning because I do still need supports in my everyday life. I do still need visuals. I do still need specific accommodations in the workplace. I work hybrid remote because there may be times where I do get very overwhelmed at the idea of being in a center or being in a specific area. So I do feel for me that the hybrid remote model is a disability accommodation for me. And that being said, high functioning, the term high functioning is typically associated with clients who are verbal, where low functioning assumes that the person cannot function at all, even if the child has specific strengths. And that's really unfair to say. That's not dignifying at all, you know. We want to be able to talk about our clients in very positive ways. So maybe they need more supports, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But that being said, low functioning is also associated with clients who are nonverbal. So now let's talk into the verbal versus nonverbal argument. When a client is spoken about being verbal, it means that they can speak, but everyone to some capacity has some form of verbal communication. When you think about it, text is a form of verbal communication. So is sign language. So is texting. So is writing. It's not vocal necessarily, but it is a form of verbal communication. Nonverbal communication is, your basic body language. It's your tone of voice. When a client is being spoken about being nonverbal, what is typically associated is that means they have no language whatsoever. Meanwhile, every single one of us is able to communicate nonverbally. We all have the capacity to refuse in some way, whether that be us shaking our head, us walking away, us looking in a different direction. Another thing too is acknowledging by nodding our heads, by putting our heads in closer to, be able to listen better and to be able to understand better. So that's why it's really, really important to acknowledge this because there are different ways that we can talk about our clients. So what can we do instead? We can talk about the different levels of supports that are needed and also talk about what their strengths are. So first, let's talk about the level of supports that's needed. So someone who is considered low functioning might need a higher amount of support in certain areas or might need a significant amount of supports. That being said, I wrote a couple of examples in here. The client requires higher needs in expressive communication, but has strengths in receptive communication. So we want to make it as strengths-based as humanly possible. Yes, they might need additional support in expressive communication, but they're so strong at being able to communicate receptively, you know, or they might be able to follow directions receptively. And then also, too, another example I wrote in the client requires minimal supports with communication and more supports with social skills. Because minimal supports with communication means, okay, that is actually a strength of theirs. They don't need nearly as much support. They need more support with being able to communicate their, or not communicate, but to engage in social skills, appropriate social skills. Also, too, instead of saying verbal and nonverbal, we can say vocal or non-vocal communication. So examples that came up for that is the client cannot communicate vocally, however, is able to communicate via PECS. So, or using PECS, because PECS is still a form of verbal communication. It's just not vocal verbal. The client has emerging vocal language, but is also able to communicate via American Sign Language. So you're looking at two different ways that they are able to communicate. And one is emerging, and one is also able to communicate via ASL. And then finally, there's also the client communicates vocally. That's how they are able to communicate. They can talk. So that's where the vocal part comes in. So now let's talk about behavior replacement and behavior reduction goals. So in order for us to target behaviors for reduction, we have to find replacement behaviors, right? But replacement behaviors should be chosen by the client with our support. We can sit here and we can write a bunch of replacement behavior goals, or we might be able to choose what we think is a great replacement behavior. But how do we know that that is effective for the client? How do we know that that's going to be realistic for the client to do? And of course, we also need to decrease target behaviors for reduction that are socially significant in nature. Behaviors that are going to impact safety is the biggest one of all. Thinking about self-injurious behaviors, thinking about elopement out in the community, those are goals that we need to work on decreasing. Meaning, if the behavior does not impede their ability to acquire new skills and live a least restrictive life, I am not targeting it. And it is not just because I'm autistic, it is because I'm looking at my clients from where they are and what they're doing to let's see how that translates to adulthood, you know? So, for example, I don't target a few of these. Number one being scripting with a sensory function. Now, I write in that there is some exceptions. And when I say some exceptions, I mean, for example, if I am working with a client on personal information, I don't want them to script something that they heard from a television show because that's impacting their ability to learn and live a least restrictive life. What if my client goes out into the community and gets lost and then they script an entire episode of a TV show? I want them to know that they can they have the ability to answer those questions and be able to do those things. And then again, self-stimulatory behavior with a sensory function, unless it is self-injurious or it harms themselves, that's when I target that. But if it's just a sensory function where it's self-stimulatory behavior, if they're flapping their hands, if they're rocking back and forth, every single one of us engages in some form of self-stimulatory behavior. You know, there has to be at some time where you might end up like flapping your own hands, or you might, move your body around at some point. Every one of us does some form of self-stimulatory behavior because it's what sort of helps us get through. And that being said, I know personally that that has been the case for me. So why should I force that upon my client? That can lead to that masking, that can lead to that burnout, and that could potentially lead to bigger, more serious target behaviors for reduction. And of course, too, non-compliance. First of all, non-compliance, a dead man cannot comply, technically. If it passes the dead man's test, or if a dead man can do it, then it's not a behavior. But what I target instead is refusal when it involves health and safety. And one of the things that I do with that is I will also write in when it comes to refusal for health and safety, if it's if they do anything other than the health and safety directive. So for example, if I am telling my client that we need to transition from the clinic door to their car, the refusal might be them refusing to leave the clinic. It might be them trying to wander to another place or trying to run away from the area, which can then lead to elopement. But it's also a refusal because they're not walking to the car. So that's where I would target that refusal. It's really all about health and safety. If my kid is not clapping their hands because I asked them to, maybe they just don't want to clap their hands, and we can teach them how to advocate for themselves and say, hey, maybe not right now, or can we do this later? Or maybe they can just indicate in some way that they just don't want to do it. If they can't say, I don't want to do it, and we can give them choices, we can give them autonomy, because at the end of the day, our clients need to be able to have decision making skills so they can live an independent life. So, anti-ABA advocates make the argument that trauma occurs when we try to mask our children's self-stimulatory behaviors. I mean, if we say, hey, stop clapping your hands, how would you like it if somebody said that to you? How would you like it if, like, let's just say, you were tapping your pen? How would you like it if someone said, hey, stop doing that? Or, if you were, turning in your chair like this, how would you like it if somebody said, hey, sit still? Show me nice hands, sit on your hands, do this. How would you like that? That would not be very dignifying to you. So imagine how that might feel to a person with autism, to an autistic person who, might need to have some of that release out there. So that's why I say we all engage in self-stimulatory behavior to some extent. Now let's talk about instructional goals. Goals should not come only from assessments, but they should be socially significant to the client and ran naturally for the sake of maintenance and generalization. Perfect example here, I did an assessment for an older client, and she was vocal verbal, and she explained to me some of the things that she really wanted to do in her life. She wants to someday become a model. But one of her biggest areas that she ran into, and one of the areas that's impeding her from doing that, is she has pretty bad OCD. Now, her OCD is not just necessarily worked on in ABA. She has mentioned to me that she wanted us to track how often she's displaying more of those obsessive behaviors. But that being said, she also wants to work towards decreasing those skills so that way she can start accessing, being able to go into modeling certain things that she's going to be expected to do, like, people doing her makeup or people doing her hair or her doing her own hair without her spraying hand sanitizer on herself. We have to really check in with our clients. So just to kind of think about this, I have some examples. Knocking on a door has a higher level of social significance than it does on a table. When you think about it, when you knock on a door, one of two things will happen. Someone will open it or someone will not open it. Knocking on a table, nothing really happens either way. Labeling items, that's another one where I write in about how labeling in the natural environment, especially labeling things that are used on a daily, everyday, real life basis, has a higher level of social significance than labeling random items on a card. I remember actually working with a BCBA who actually wanted her kid to label a narwhal just because. That's not socially significant to the kid. He doesn't care about narwhals. He doesn't really like or even have any interest in that. So that being said, it's not real life. That's not how real life works. You don't just label things on cards. You have to be able to label things as you go and understand items that you come in contact with on a daily basis. Another example that I write in is waiting. Who waits by sitting there and staring off into space? I don't know a single person who does that. I know people who wait by reading a magazine, though. I know people who wait by, playing with toys while they're waiting to be called on a doctor's office or texting on a phone. So that's why, again, like when it comes to waiting, it doesn't have to just be, or it really shouldn't just be them sitting and staring in silence and going, okay, wait, them doing that for 1 to 5 minutes, that could be pretty awkward. So teaching them how to wait by engaging in other activities is a way that I've personally done this. And of course, sitting at a table, I ask personally, why does a young child have to sit at a table beyond eating or doing tabletop activities like writing, maybe like painting, if they don't have access to an easel, anything like that? And the reason why I ask this too is because a lot of our kids go to school. They're expected to sit at a table. They're expected to sit at a desk all day. So why should I, make them sit at a table for even longer periods of time? So that's where that social significance of how can we conduct our goals away from the table? How can we actually, target this in a variety of settings? How can we make sure that the goals that we work on match the environment they're supposed to be in? Of course, too, when you're using assessments, they really should be age appropriate and functional to a client. And I just wrote in a few examples here. I've seen it where, unfortunately, some clients who have been older than the criterion age are being tested. For example, I actually very recently saw a 17-year-old be tested on a VB-MAP. The criterion age is 48 months, which is 4 years old. That's a 13-year age gap. You should not be using assessments that have that criterion age. And yeah, I mean, really at this point, we really need to think about what are critical skills that they need to work on. Let's find a different assessment that works better. And of course, I also really think it's important to talk about autistic advocacy organizations and autistic advocates. This is really just like a near and dear area of my heart. So different organizations, Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, otherwise known as ASAN, their organization is all about autistic advocacy. Nothing about us without us. And so it's really important to do your research on Autistic Self-Advocacy Network and also Autistic Women's and Non-Binary Network, because AWN focuses on providing resources for autistic women, girls, trans feminine, and trans masculine people. And that neurodiversity is for everyone. Because again, we want to make sure that our clients that are autistic or have autism know that it is okay to, advocate for yourself, and it is okay to want things for yourself. And, there's different resources that are out there that can help you. We want to help you get those resources as well. I also know of a few advocates as well. So I wrote in Kerry Magro. So he recently published a book called Autistics on Autism, Stories You Need to Hear About What Helped Them While Growing Up and Pursuing Their Dreams. Because, and this was a really good book. I actually had the chance to read this. And, again, we want to teach our clients that autism is not it's not a debilitating life sentence sort of situation. And I say debilitating life sentence because, we want to make sure that we're teaching our clients that their identity is valid and that who they are as people are valid. And so that's why, for me, it's really important to talk about advocates in the community. Kieran Rose is another one. She's also an autistic self-advocate. So the autisticadvocate.com is where you can find information about her. Also, you may have heard of Eileen Lamb. She is an autistic mother who also has three children, two of them being autistic. And she also published a book called All Across the Spectrum. So she has her website over there. And then also there are a variety of autistic podcasters that talk about the neurodiversity movement. And I think that as behavior analysts or people going into behavior analysis, it's really important to really make sure that we are listening to those voices and uplifting those voices. Yes, we may hear the ABA's abuse argument. We may hear, the sad things about ABA, but also too, it's really important that we do listen to those voices and that we do say, hey, you know what? Your feelings are valid. How you feel is valid. Let's do something to change. So where do we go from here? I think the number one thing to really do is to get buy-in. We get buy-in by getting feedback and stakeholders, um, by getting feedback from stakeholders and clients on a regular basis, so we need to make sure that we are actually checking in. Don't just do it at the start, do it throughout. Ask clients and stakeholders what their goals are from the get-go and check in throughout services. I think it's also really important too to conduct choice measures and preference assessments throughout services and check to see what works and doesn't work. In my case, I was able to actually have the opportunity to be checked in on, you know, granted, my mom was the one who did that, and that's what a mom should be doing anyways. But also, too, when we're doing those things, when we are checking in, it shows that we care. It shows that we're not just here to, you know, participate in a meeting and that's required by our insurance funder or that's required by the company and we mark a checkbox. No, it's there to help our clients know that we're here to provide compassionate care. I also think that it's really important to teach autistic people that their identity is valid. This is a scary but true fact, and I do apologize in advance because there is going to be some really, really sad statistics that I'm about to explain. Um, while most autistic self-advocates are proud of their identity, there's also an increased risk of suicidal attempts and successes. This goes into bullying. This goes into a lot of harmful things that happen to autistic people throughout their lives. I know personally I've been bullied and it's not fun. There's also an increased risk of bullying, victimization, self-isolation, anxiety, depression, and negative experiences as a whole. And so when we teach our clients that how they are and how they feel is valid, it is so important to really emphasize that, because people with autism do deal with social stigma on a daily basis. And so, coming from my own experience growing up, even though, yes, I got ABA therapy, my mental health was absolutely impacted. And it wasn't necessarily the direct result of ABA, it's the direct result of having an autism diagnosis, talking about autism, and even too, just behaving in a way that was different from my neurotypical peers. And I say different in quotations because there have been times where I would engage in more self-stimulatory behaviors or behaviors that were, odd according to my classmates. And so they found that as a reason to make fun of me and make me feel less than. Unfortunately, too, in a 2021 study, autistic males were 3 times more likely to commit suicide, where autistic females were 2.63 times more likely. That's 2.63 to 3 times way too much. That's way too much. Nobody should ever feel like this. And also, too, in a 2023 study, 64% of autistic people are subject to any form of victimization of bullying. That's way too many. That's way too much. And so we really need, as providers, to not only teach autistic people that their identity is valid, but also teach neurotypical people that neurodivergent people are different, not less than. As somebody who has worked with a lot of autistic clients and has worked with a lot of clients just with different disabilities as a whole, I've taught them a lot of these things. But that being said, the lesson goes beyond teaching the client about, their identity being valid. It goes into how can other people, how can neurotypical children, how can neurotypical kids or people in general treat autistic people and people with any disabilities with respect. So that being said, it is important to not only listen, because that's half the battle, but to seek and apply the feedback that is given by the community. We are a life-changing field. I know I've said that multiple times during this talk, but we are a life-changing field. And so it's really important that we don't just listen, we do our homework. So in conclusion, that being said, I talked a lot about my story. I talked a lot about how there was like the mental health impact, but also I think it's really important to note the following. So the person gets to decide what is the best way to be addressed, whether that be autistic or person with autism. We shouldn't always assume that we're always right and our way is the way. That being said, that's why it's important to do your homework, do your research, gauge buy-in, listen. We're a guest in our clients' lives because, again, we're here to teach our lives or teach our clients about how we can help them. We can help our clients. We can make their lives better. We have the capacity to do that. And assessments are a guide, not an end all be all, and have to be chosen appropriately. We need to be individualized in our practice. And the reason for that is, again, because of the fact that we are changing individual lives. We shouldn't be teaching the same things and expect, the same teaching methods to be applied for all of our students. It really should be on an individual basis. Most of all, ABA from my lens is not only about applying the science, but it's about respecting the person for who they are and teaching what is socially significant to the client. And it's our responsibility as providers to provide client-centered care. I really hope that that hits home because as somebody who is autistic, went through ABA, and is now in the field, kind of like doing a little bit of a reverse sort of situation here. I think it's really important that we apply the skills that, we need to have to be compassionate, you know? It's not enough to just listen. It's not enough to just be physically present. We have to be as present emotionally, mentally as we can. And it's really important too that our clients are being listened to in all different ways, because that's how, again, we can bring and provide compassion to our field. So I understand that there is a Q&A. So I'll go ahead.
Yeah, Michelle, thank you so much. This was so informative, and I loved hearing your perspective. I think you shared so many wonderful tips and, recommendations. And like you said, while you're one person and you have your own opinion, I think these are all valid opinions. So we're open for questions. So I know I had a question for you, Michelle.
Yeah.
So sometimes, when I work with parents, parents will often push for, especially I think when their child is young. I have some parents that are like, oh, we don't use the word autism. We don't want our child to know about autism, or that he has autism. We really want him to be quote unquote neurotypical. How do you suggest, we, collaborate and work with parents that have that mindset?
Wow. Well, I think for starters, it sounds like, when it comes to the parents, sometimes they sort of get into a martyr type of situation where it's like, why is this my child? Why is this happening to me? And I think it's really important that when we are providing compassionate coaching for families, that we talk about, first of all, what autism is and why it's that much more important to be talking about what autism is, to talk about some of the strengths of autism, talk about some of the cool things that, their child is capable of. When I come in and I do some of my caregiver support, what I do is, yes, I do talk about, their diagnosis and them having autism and everything, but I also talk about the progress that they've made in a lot of different areas. I talk about their strengths because at the end of the day, we're talking about how, our clients are doing so great at X, Y, and Z. They might need more support with A, B, and C. But that being said, too, I think because autism still has a stigma that is attached to it, I think it's really, I think, we do have to, we have to ultimately we do ultimately have to educate our families on, why we can accept our children and why it's really important to, be as compassionate as possible for our clients, but then also to, provide that friendly reminder. Yes, it is okay to feel sad about a diagnosis. Um, at the same time, though, this is your child's life, and we want them to know that they are a valid human being. Their diagnosis does not make them any less than. It's just a label, So that's my advice.
Thank you. That I have one more follow-up question. Um,
Yes.
I oftentimes parents will ask me, do you think it's too young for us to disclose a child's diagnosis? And I've had some parents that are very transparent, and I've had some parents that are like, oh, he's too young, we shouldn't tell him. Do you have any thoughts on like when do you think it's best to share with their child about the autism diagnosis?
Man, I mean, I would say start early, just so that way they can start understanding like what autism is, what it means to have autism, and what it's like. One thing I will say for myself, I did not know that I had autism until I was 7 years old. And I kind of wish that I had known ahead of time. But that being said, the only reason why I knew about having autism at that age was because I was pulled out of class specifically so that way somebody could come in and talk about autism. And so that was a little bit of a sad situation, but I got pulled out of class. I was told that I have autism. This person was coming in to talk about autism and to talk about me having autism. And that's a situation where I really wish that I had learned about my autism ahead of time. That's something that I wish that, my family would have been a little bit more understanding about. I think if I were to ask my mom why I didn't know about my autism diagnosis until then, I think her answer would probably be because she didn't know how to word it or she didn't know how to describe it. And I think that as practitioners, we can provide some sort of way to give them that definition of what autism is and what does it mean for you and what does it mean for your life. And you know just because you have autism doesn't mean that you're less than. It doesn't mean that you are, you know, you're you're not I guess going back to being less than, it just means that you have a label and sometimes people do have labels and that's okay. So I think the best way to answer this is try to do it early, but also one thing that I can also recommend too is definitely getting some children's stories about autism. So that way you can talk to them about what autism is, what neurodiversity is, and also get them to fully like understand, hey, this is what this means. So
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, this is something I struggle with because, I have, some parents that are like, do not use the word autism during your therapy session. Like, and he's a child, so I have to obviously like go with what parents are recommending. But I'm like, he knows, like, I'm sure this child knows something's off because, like you said, if he's being pulled out, this child is getting a lot of therapy. He knows like there's something off. And I wish some of the families would, have that candid conversation. But, at the end of the day, it's the parents' decision and we have to be respectful of that too.
yeah, I think sometimes some of it comes from culture. I know sometimes, some of the culture, some of the families that I've worked with within different cultures might not like totally accept it. And it's where, okay, we might need to work on accepting this. This is not something that is going to go away in their life, so this is a part of who they are. Let's be accepting. Let's come up with ways that we can be accepting. What are some really great things about your child that you know? And it doesn't have to be about autism. It can be like they're great at writing, they're great at spelling, they're great at singing. And, you know, it can be something that is different from autism. Autism is just a part of the equation. So.